Her ex-husband mocked her in court, thinking she had nothing, until the judge read the final document. The world saw their marriage as a perfect union. He was a successful businessman, admired by many, and she was the devoted wife who stood by his side through every milestone. People envied her life, believing she lived in luxury and comfort, never needing to lift a finger. She had met him when he was just starting out, filled with ambition but struggling financially. Back then, they had dreams of building a future together, hand in hand, as equals. She supported him in every way possible, helping him organize meetings, managing finances, and even assisting in marketing strategies. Yet, as his success grew, so did the distance between them. At first, it was subtle. He became busier, more absorbed in his work, and less interested in their relationship. She brushed it off, telling herself that it was natural for a man with such high ambitions to become preoccupied. But then, the affection began to disappear. The kind words, the small gestures of appreciation, the shared laughter, all faded into distant memories. Whenever she tried to talk to him, he dismissed her concerns, saying she was overreacting. "You don't understand how much pressure I'm under," he would say, his voice cold and detached. She wanted to believe that things would return to how they once were, but deep down, she felt something shifting. As time went on, he stopped including her in any discussions about the business, despite her having played a crucial role in its foundation. He hired consultants, lawyers, and managers, leaving her entirely out of the equation. "It's just business," he told her. "You wouldn't understand." But she did understand. She saw how he was pushing her away, ensuring that she had no say in the company that they had built together. She began to feel like an outsider in her own home, a silent observer to the life they were supposed to share. Then came the humiliation. It started with small remarks at home, condescending tones, dismissive laughs. Then, in social gatherings, he would mock her in front of colleagues, making jokes about how she was just a housewife who spent his money. People laughed, assuming it was all in good humor, but she felt the sting of every word. He relished in making her feel insignificant, as if reminding her that she was nothing without him. She tried to confront him, but he would always brush it off with, "I'm just joking." "Don't be so sensitive." One evening, at a high-profile event, he humiliated her in front of a room full of executives and investors. Someone had asked about the early days of the company, and when she began to speak, he interrupted, laughing. "Oh, please," he scoffed. She was just there to make coffee and take notes. "The real work was done by me." The room erupted in laughter, but she felt her heart shatter. That night, as she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, she realized one thing: this wasn't just neglect. This was intentional. He wanted her to believe she was nothing. But she refused to let him win. She had always believed that marriage was built on trust, mutual respect, and companionship. But as time passed, she felt like she was living with a stranger. He no longer sought her advice, no longer valued her presence. When they attended gatherings together, he treated her as nothing more than an accessory, something to complete his image of a perfect, powerful man. The once deep conversations they shared were replaced by short, indifferent exchanges. She felt like a ghost, invisible in her own home. The financial control started subtly. He insisted on handling all their money, claiming it was easier that way. At first, she trusted him, believing he had their best interests at heart. But over time, she noticed how he started limiting her access to their accounts. "You don't need to worry about these things," he would say when she asked about expenses. Slowly, she realized that she no longer had control over anything. Even the credit cards in her name required his approval. If she questioned him, he would respond with mock concern. "Are you accusing me of something? Don't you trust your own husband?" She was trapped in a gilded cage. To the outside world, she had everything: a luxurious home, designer clothes, expensive jewelry. But what good was any of it when she had no freedom? She had no say in her own life. She started keeping track of every belittling comment, every decision he made without her, every moment that reminded her that she was no longer his partner, only his possession. And deep down, she knew it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. The moment she decided to leave was not dramatic. There was no screaming argument, no explosive confrontation. It happened in silence, in the dead of night, as she sat alone in their vast bedroom, feeling the weight of years of neglect and humiliation. She had given everything to this marriage: her love, her support, her patience. And in return, she had been reduced to nothing more than an afterthought in his life. She gathered her courage and met with a divorce lawyer in secret. She knew this would not be easy. He was a man who thrived on control, and the thought of her walking away from him, especially on her own terms, would enrage him. The lawyer warned her that this battle would not be simple. "He will try to leave you with nothing," he said. "But you have more power than you think." The day she told him she wanted a divorce, he laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh or an amused chuckle, it was a laugh of pure arrogance. "You think you can leave me?" he sneered. "Go ahead. See how far you get without me." His confidence was unsettling, but she refused to show fear. She simply stood her ground and repeated her words. "I want a divorce." His demeanor changed instantly. His expression darkened, his smile vanished. "Fine," he said coldly. "But don't expect to take a single penny from me." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because what he didn't know, what he would never have suspected, was that she had prepared for this moment. And when the time came, he would learn the truth in the most humiliating way possible. The divorce process started with cold detachment, but she knew that was just the calm before the storm. He acted as if he didn't care, as if she was insignificant enough to be discarded without a second thought. But beneath his composed facade, she sensed his need to control the outcome. His confidence was infuriating, his arrogance unshaken. He walked around their house as if it was already decided she would leave with nothing, and he would continue his life untouched. He didn't even ask why she wanted the divorce. To him, the reason didn't matter. What mattered was ensuring she walked away humiliated, powerless, and regretful. His legal team wasted no time in attacking. His lawyer, a man known for his ruthless tactics, filed an aggressive petition claiming she contributed nothing to the marriage and had no right to any financial support. Every asset, every account, every property was declared solely his. They painted her as a spoiled, dependent wife who lived off his success without ever lifting a finger. Every contribution she had made was erased as if she had never existed beyond the title of Mrs. Blackwell. She expected the lies, but seeing them written in legal documents still sent a chill through her. It was as if he had rewritten history, making sure she was nothing more than a footnote in his grand story. She remained silent, unshaken, refusing to engage in his childish power plays. He mistook her silence for weakness, for submission. He believed she had no fight left in her, that she would accept whatever scraps he decided to throw her way. But he had no idea what was coming. While he played his petty games, she was preparing for the moment he would regret underestimating her. She had watched him carefully over the years, learned how he operated, and now she would turn that knowledge against him. The battle was only beginning, and she would make sure she was ready for the war ahead. The day of the first court hearing arrived, and he entered the courtroom with the air of a man who had already won. His tailored suit, his perfectly polished shoes, the smug expression on his face, all of it screamed confidence. He walked past her without a glance, as if she were nothing more than a nuisance he had to deal with before moving on with his life. His lawyer greeted him with a firm handshake, whispering something that made him chuckle. To them, this wasn't a legal proceeding, it was a formality, a performance before the inevitable ruling in his favor. She sat quietly, her expression unreadable. She knew the judge would need time to sift through the details of their case, but she also knew her ex-husband's overconfidence would be his downfall. He truly believed that his version of events, the one where she was an ungrateful housewife undeserving of assent, was the only reality that mattered. He underestimated her patience, her intelligence, and most importantly, the truth she had been holding on to. As the judge began reviewing the case, his lawyer wasted no time launching the first attack. "Your Honor," the lawyer began smoothly, "this is a simple case. My client built his company from the ground up while his wife contributed nothing financially. She was supported entirely by him and has no legal claim to any assets. We are requesting an immediate dismissal of her demands." The words were sharp, calculated, designed to humiliate. Her ex-husband sat back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes glinting with amusement. He was enjoying this, watching her be belittled, watching her struggle against an impossible fight. But his smirk wouldn't last forever. She remained composed, letting them have their moment of arrogance. Her lawyer, a calm and strategic woman who had seen far too many men like him, didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled faintly before speaking. "Your Honor, before we accept this fictional narrative, I would like to present preliminary evidence that my client was not only involved in her husband's business but played a crucial role in its early success." The statement was like a hairline crack in a perfectly polished surface, barely noticeable, but enough to plant doubt. The judge raised an eyebrow, interested. The opposing lawyer scoffed. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this is an attempt to rewrite history. There is no record of her involvement in the company's operations." His voice was filled with certainty, but her lawyer was prepared. "Actually, there is," she countered, sliding a thick folder onto the judge's desk. "We have emails, meeting notes, and financial records showing my client's direct involvement in the company's growth." A flicker of uncertainty crossed her ex-husband's face, barely perceptible but present. It was the first crack in his unshakable confidence. The judge took the documents, flipping through the pages with growing interest. "These are preliminary," her lawyer continued, "but we will provide further evidence in the coming sessions." Her ex-husband shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening against the polished wood of the table. It was subtle, but she had spent years learning to read his body language. For the first time, he wasn't entirely sure of his victory. He may not have realized it yet, but the power was shifting. And she wasn't finished. Not even close. After the hearing, he wasted no time cornering her outside the courtroom. "That was cute," he sneered, his voice laced with condescension. "Digging through old emails like some desperate scavenger. Do you really think a few documents will change anything?" His laughter was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. It was the same laugh he had used when he humiliated her at dinner parties, when he dismissed her in meetings, when he stripped her of her worth with nothing more than a few careless words. She met his gaze without flinching. "You always underestimated me," she said, her voice steady. That was your first mistake." His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly. "Enjoy this little act while it lasts," he said smoothly. "Because when this is over, you'll be lucky to walk away with the clothes on your back." He turned and strode away, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the marble hallway. She exhaled slowly, but there was no fear in her anymore, only determination. He still believed he was untouchable, that the outcome had already been decided. But he had just made his second mistake, assuming she had played her best card too early. What he didn't realize was that she had much more left to reveal. And when the time came, his laughter would be replaced with stunned silence. Days passed, but the smugness in her ex-husband's demeanor remained unshaken. He moved through the courtroom like a man convinced of his invincibility, treating the proceedings as a mere inconvenience rather than a battle he needed to fight. He believed the judge would eventually grow tired of her petty claims and dismiss her entirely. His arrogance was so absolute that he didn't even bother preparing for the next hearing, assuming his lawyer could handle it with ease. But he failed to realize something crucial: this wasn't just about money or assets. This was about justice, and she wasn't about to let him escape the consequences of his actions. Her lawyer worked tirelessly, gathering every document, every email, and every witness statement that could prove her rightful contributions to his company. There was no denying that she had been there from the very beginning, drafting marketing strategies, handling finances, and even securing early investors. He had buried the truth beneath layers of lies, rewriting history to suit his narrative. But the paper trail remained, a silent witness to all the work she had done. The more evidence they compiled, the clearer it became: he hadn't just underestimated her, he had underestimated the very system he thought would protect him. The upcoming hearing was crucial. The judge had requested financial records and proof of business involvement, and her team had more than enough to present. Meanwhile, her ex-husband remained blissfully unaware, still convinced she was grasping at straws. He had spent years dismissing her, treating her as insignificant, believing she was incapable of standing on her own. But the storm was coming, and he was too blind to see the dark clouds forming over his carefully crafted empire. The day of the second hearing arrived, and as expected, he waltzed into the courtroom with that same arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He barely acknowledged her presence, instead choosing to chat casually with his lawyer as if they were discussing an unimportant business deal. To him, this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, something that would soon be swept away by the undeniable power of his influence. He believed that money, reputation, and connections would shield him from any real consequences. As the session began, her lawyer presented the newly uncovered documents, emails where he had directly discussed business strategies with her, financial records proving her involvement in securing crucial deals, and even old contracts showing that she had a legal claim to a portion of the company. The room fell silent as the judge carefully examined the evidence. The shift in the courtroom's energy was subtle but unmistakable. The confidence in her ex-husband's face wavered, his fingers tightening slightly around the armrest of his chair. His lawyer, however, remained defiant. "Your Honor, these documents are being misrepresented. While my client may have discussed business matters with his wife, that does not constitute formal involvement in the company." But the judge wasn't easily swayed. He turned to her ex-husband, his sharp gaze piercing through the man's facade. "If these documents are accurate, they suggest that your wife was more involved in your company than you previously stated. Do you have a response?" The room grew tense as her ex-husband hesitated for the first time. It was the smallest crack in his armor, but she knew this was only the beginning. For the first time since the proceedings began, he was no longer entirely in control. His smirk, once unshakable, had faded slightly, replaced by a tight-lipped expression of frustration. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering harshly, his posture no longer relaxed. She had spent years learning his body language, recognizing the small tells that betrayed his emotions. Right now, beneath the cold exterior, he was panicking. He had convinced himself that she would fold under pressure, that she would give up before it ever reached this stage. But now, reality was beginning to set in. She wasn't backing down. His lawyer attempted to regain control of the narrative, dismissing the documents as irrelevant and insisting that they held no real legal weight. But the judge wasn't satisfied with vague dismissals. He requested further investigation into the company's financial history, including any legal agreements made during its formation. That was the moment she saw it, her ex-husband's hand tightening into a fist on the table, his jaw clenched. He had something to hide, and now, the court was beginning to realize it. As the session ended, he left the courtroom without his usual arrogance. His movements were sharper, his pace quicker, and for the first time, he refused to meet her gaze. She watched as he stormed out, his lawyer struggling to keep up with him. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that he could rewrite history to serve his own interests. But the truth had begun to unravel, and with it, the illusion of his power. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He had always been a man who thrived on control. Every aspect of his life, from his business to his personal affairs, was meticulously crafted to fit the image he wanted the world to see. But control was slipping through his fingers, and he could feel it. That night, for the first time in years, he felt something he never thought he would: uncertainty. He paced in his office, reading through the court transcripts, scanning the documents her legal team had presented. He told himself it was nothing, that the judge would eventually rule in his favor. But doubt crept in, an unwelcome intruder in the fortress of his ego. He had underestimated her. That was his first mistake. He had assumed she would walk away quietly, that she would accept whatever settlement he offered without question. But she hadn't. Instead, she had built a case strong enough to make even his most trusted advisors nervous. His lawyer had assured him that she was fighting a losing battle, but now, even he seemed less certain. "We need to prepare for the possibility that the judge might not dismiss her claims as easily as we thought," the lawyer admitted. It was the first time he had heard any acknowledgement of real risk, and he hated it. He poured himself a drink, staring out the window of his penthouse office, the city lights stretching endlessly before him. He had built everything from the ground up, or at least, that was the story he had always told himself. But now, the carefully curated version of his success was at risk of being exposed. He clenched his jaw, determination hardening his features. He wasn't going to let her win. If she thought she could outmaneuver him, she was wrong. He would find a way to crush her case, no matter what it took. The morning after the hearing, his arrogance returned, though this time it felt forced. He was grasping at straws, determined to regain control of the situation before it slipped entirely from his hands. His lawyer advised him to remain calm, to let the process unfold naturally, but patience had never been his strength. He wanted results, and he wanted them now. If the court was beginning to question his narrative, he needed to shift the balance back in his favor. And what better way to do that than to discredit her before she could do more damage? That same afternoon, an article surfaced in a business magazine, one filled with anonymous sources questioning her character, painting her as an unstable woman seeking revenge. Ex-wife of CEO files baseless claims in divorce battle, the headline read. The story was riddled with half-truths, carefully constructed to make her look desperate, like a woman clinging to a past she had no real stake in. The timing was no coincidence. He wanted to humiliate her, to make sure that when she walked into court, she would already be judged in the public eye. She read the article with quiet resolve, her fingers gripping the edges of the newspaper. He thought this would break her, that she would crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. But he had miscalculated again. If anything, this only fueled her determination. He was resorting to dirty tactics because he was afraid. He wouldn't have needed to attack her publicly if he truly believed he had already won. The cracks in his confidence were growing, and soon they would shatter entirely. At the next hearing, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The judge wasted no time addressing the media coverage. "Mr. Blackwell," he said, his voice firm, "it has come to my attention that there have been public attempts to discredit the opposing party. I strongly advise against any efforts to manipulate this case outside this courtroom." The warning was clear: any further attempts to interfere with the proceedings could result in legal consequences. Her ex-husband forced a tight-lipped smile, nodding as if he understood. But she saw the anger in his eyes. He had expected the judge to ignore the article, to let him continue his game without repercussions. His lawyer quickly tried to smooth things over. "Your Honor, my client had no involvement in any media coverage. These things tend to take on a life of their own." The judge didn't look convinced. Instead, he turned his attention to the documents her lawyer had presented in the previous session. "I have reviewed the preliminary evidence," he said, flipping through the files. "And I must say, there is reason to believe that Mrs. Blackwell played a more significant role in the company's early development than initially claimed." The air in the room shifted. Her ex-husband, who had been lounging in his chair moments earlier, suddenly straightened. His lawyer attempted to interject, but the judge held up a hand. "We will need to conduct a more thorough examination of the company's records," he continued. "I am ordering a full financial audit." Her ex-husband's fingers clenched around the table's edge, his knuckles turning white. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had spent years ensuring that every trace of her involvement was erased. But now, the court itself was demanding answers. For the first time, she saw something in him she had never seen before: genuine fear. It was only for a fleeting second, a barely perceptible flicker in his expression, but it was there. He knew what the audit could reveal. He had buried the truth, rewritten the past, convinced himself that he was the sole architect of his success. But numbers didn't lie. If the court traced the company's origins, they would find her fingerprints everywhere, on financial reports, business strategies, even in the very foundation of the contracts he now claimed as solely his own. That night, he didn't go home. Instead, he locked himself in his office, poring over every document, every email, searching for anything that could be used to turn the case back in his favor. He called his lawyer at midnight, demanding solutions. "Find a way to stop this audit," he ordered, his voice sharp with desperation. But his lawyer hesitated, something he had never done before. "This is out of our hands," he admitted. "The judge has made his decision." His ex-husband slammed his fist against the desk. This was spiraling out of control faster than he had anticipated. Meanwhile, she remained calm, watching everything unfold with quiet satisfaction. He had spent years thinking he was untouchable, that she was nothing more than a powerless woman he had discarded. But now, the truth was clawing its way back to the surface, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. She had been patient, had played the long game, and now, she was finally seeing the cracks in his perfectly curated image. He had built an empire on lies, and soon, it would come crashing down around him. The financial audit moved quickly, with investigators digging deep into the company's records. The process was meticulous, leaving no stone unturned. Every financial transaction, every contract, every internal memo was scrutinized. And as the days passed, his confidence eroded further. His carefully controlled world was slipping away, piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His lawyer tried to reassure him, insisting that they would find a way to spin the results in his favor. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just a legal battle anymore. This was about the truth, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one controlling the narrative. At the next court session, the lead auditor presented their findings. "Your Honor," he said, clearing his throat, "our investigation has uncovered significant evidence that contradicts the defendant's claims." Mrs. Blackwell was not only involved in the early stages of the company but played an essential role in its financial management and growth. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Her ex-husband's jaw tightened, his lawyer shifting uncomfortably beside him. The judge nodded, his expression unreadable. "This evidence raises serious questions," he said. "We will need further testimony before I make my final ruling." But the damage had already been done. The doubt was no longer just a shadow in the back of the judge's mind, it was now written clearly in the records of the court. He had spent years erasing her contributions, treating her as if she had been nothing more than an accessory to his success. But now, the undeniable truth had surfaced. And soon, he would face the consequences of his own arrogance. The courtroom's silence was suffocating. For years, he had moved through life with unchecked confidence, manipulating situations to serve his interests. But now, the power was slipping through his fingers like sand. He forced himself to remain still, to keep his expression neutral, but inside, his mind was racing. The audit findings had changed everything. His lawyer had assured him they would find a way to dismiss the evidence, but the judge had made it clear this wasn't something that could be swept under the rug. His version of history was unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. That night, he locked himself in his office, reviewing every document, every loophole that could salvage his case. But it was pointless. The numbers spoke for themselves. She hadn't just been a silent observer, she had been instrumental in building the company from the ground up. There were financial transactions in her name, contracts she had negotiated, and early business plans drafted in her handwriting. The more he read, the more he realized just how deeply she had woven herself into the foundation of his success. He had convinced himself he had done it alone, but the truth was undeniable. And now, that truth was standing against him in court. She, however, remained patient. She had played this game carefully, anticipating every move he might make. He had thought she would crumble under the weight of his manipulation, that she would accept the role of the forgotten ex-wife. But instead, she had been methodically chipping away at his defenses, revealing every crack, every flaw in his carefully constructed story. And with every new revelation, the walls around him grew tighter. He had always believed himself untouchable, but now, he was beginning to understand, he was not invincible. The next morning, his lawyer arrived with an alternative strategy, one final attempt to control the narrative. "We need to settle," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "If this goes to a final ruling, we could lose more than just money." His ex-husband's jaw tightened. The thought of settling, of giving her anything, made his blood boil. "Absolutely not," he snapped. "I built that company. She deserves nothing." But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at the edges of his confidence. He could feel the weight of the case pressing down on him, suffocating him. His lawyer exhaled, choosing his words carefully. If the judge rules in her favor, it won't just be about money. The media will latch onto this. It will ruin your reputation. That hit a nerve. He had spent years crafting his image, ensuring that the world saw him as a self-made man, a genius entrepreneur. If people learned the truth, that his ex-wife had been a key player in his rise to success, his credibility would shatter. Investors would lose trust, business partners would hesitate, and the carefully constructed empire he had built would begin to crumble. That afternoon, a settlement offer was sent to her legal team. The amount was significant, enough to make most people walk away. But she barely glanced at it before shaking her head. "No," she said simply. Her lawyer studied her for a moment before nodding. She wasn't here for money, she was here for justice. And she would not allow him to buy his way out of accountability. The battle wasn't over yet. And the final blow was still to come. The media had caught wind of the case, and it was no longer something he could control. The once private divorce proceedings were now making headlines, and people were beginning to ask questions. Business analysts reviewed the audit findings, noting the inconsistencies in his narrative. Former employees started speaking out, confirming that she had been deeply involved in the company's foundation. The more he tried to suppress the truth, the louder it became. At first, he dismissed the coverage, insisting it would blow over. But then came the interviews. A former financial advisor revealed that she had been the one to handle critical investments in the early years. An ex-marketing director admitted that many of the company's breakthrough ideas had originated from her. Bit by bit, the public perception of him shifted. He was no longer the self-made businessman, he was the man who had erased his wife's contributions, who had tried to silence the truth. She watched as the fallout unfolded, but she took no pleasure in it. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the truth that had been stolen from her. He had mocked her, humiliated her, and tried to reduce her to nothing. But now, the world was finally seeing the truth. He had underestimated her, dismissed her as weak. But in the end, he was the one who had lost everything. The courtroom was packed on the day of the final ruling. The tension was thick, the air heavy with anticipation. He sat rigid in his chair, his hands clenched into fists. This was his last chance to salvage what remained of his power, his reputation. He told himself that the judge wouldn't completely rule against him, that there had to be a way to spin this in his favor. But deep down, he knew better. The evidence was too overwhelming. The narrative had shifted beyond his control. The judge took his time, flipping through the case files one final time before clearing his throat. After reviewing all presented evidence, he began, "It is clear that Mrs. Blackwell played a substantial role in the establishment and early success of the defendant's company. Furthermore, the financial audit confirms that she is entitled to a significant portion of the company's assets." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but her ex-husband barely reacted. He was frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. In addition, the judge continued, "There is reason to believe that financial misconduct may have taken place in the handling of marital assets. I am ordering a further investigation into these claims." That was the final blow. His face turned pale as the reality settled in. This wasn't just about losing money. This was about losing everything, his company, his reputation, and possibly his freedom. She remained still, watching as the man who had once held so much power over her sat in stunned silence. Justice had been served. And there was nothing he could do to change it. The courtroom emptied slowly, reporters and onlookers whispering amongst themselves as they processed the verdict. He remained seated, his breathing shallow, his mind reeling. This was supposed to be impossible. He had spent years ensuring that she would never have the upper hand, that she would never be anything more than a footnote in his story. But now, he was the one fading into the background, his legacy forever tainted by the truth. Outside, she stood tall, inhaling deeply as she stepped into the sunlight. For the first time in years, she felt free. This battle had never been about money, it had been about reclaiming her voice, proving that she had never been as insignificant as he made her believe. She had fought for herself, for the truth, and she had won. The weight that had once pressed so heavily on her shoulders was gone. She had spent so long being silenced, dismissed, erased. But now, the world knew who she was. As she walked away from the courthouse, she didn't look back. There was nothing left for her in the past. The man who had once controlled her life was nothing more than a shadow now, one that would fade into obscurity while she stepped forward into a future entirely her own. This wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the beginning of something new. And for the first time in years, she was ready. News of the ruling spread quickly, dominating headlines and social media. The man who had once been celebrated as a self-made entrepreneur was now the subject of intense scrutiny. Investors began pulling their support, stocks in his company wavered, and business partners distanced themselves. His once loyal associates, those who had laughed at his jokes and praised his brilliance, now hesitated to even mention his name. No one wanted to be associated with a man exposed for deception and greed. He had built his empire on the illusion of sole success, and now, that illusion was crumbling. For years, he had dictated every narrative, controlling how the world perceived him. But now, he was powerless. His reputation, once his greatest asset, had become a liability. He tried to fight back, issuing statements claiming the trial was biased, that the evidence had been misrepresented. But the more he spoke, the worse it became. People weren't interested in his excuses, they were interested in the truth. And the truth was undeniable. His success had not been his alone. The woman he had belittled, humiliated, and erased had played a fundamental role in everything he had built. And now, the world knew it. She watched from a distance, unaffected by his desperate attempts to salvage what remained of his influence. None of it mattered anymore. The battle was over, and she had won, not just in court, but in reclaiming her dignity, her worth, and her place in her own story. For years, he had tried to convince her that she was nothing without him. But in the end, it was he who was lost without her. And no amount of money, power, or lies could change that. For the first time in years, she woke up without the weight of his presence looming over her. The silence of her new home was liberating, free from the echoes of his mockery and control. She had expected to feel relief, but what she felt was something much deeper, peace. She no longer had to prove herself, no longer had to fight to be heard. She was free, truly free, to live on her own terms. The money she had won in court was substantial, but it wasn't about wealth. It was about having the ability to choose her own path, without his shadow following her. She took her time rebuilding her life, carefully deciding what she wanted now that she was no longer defined by her past. She reconnected with old passions, the dreams she had abandoned when she had dedicated herself to his ambitions. Slowly, she started something of her own, a business, not out of necessity, but because she wanted to. Not to prove anything to anyone, but because she finally had the space to be herself. The difference was clear. This time, she wasn't doing it for someone else's benefit. She was doing it for herself. One evening, she walked through the city, passing by the building that once housed his company. She paused for a moment, looking up at the windows where she had once spent countless hours working behind the scenes, uncredited and unseen. But she felt no bitterness, no anger. Instead, she smiled, knowing that she no longer needed validation from that place, from him, from anyone. He had taken years from her, but he had failed to take away her future. And that, more than anything, was her greatest victory. While she was rediscovering herself, he was watching everything he had built slip through his fingers. The judge's decision had been only the beginning. With the financial audit exposing years of deception, new investigations had opened. Regulators began looking into his company's records, questioning the legality of certain transactions. The lawsuits followed soon after. Former employees, silent for years, now felt emboldened to come forward. Allegations of unethical business practices, manipulated contracts, and financial misconduct painted an image of a man whose empire had been built on fragile foundations. His business associates, the ones who had once praised him, now wanted nothing to do with him. His closest allies disappeared, leaving him to deal with the consequences alone. The media that had once celebrated his success now scrutinized his every move. No matter what statement he released, no matter how he tried to shift blame, the damage was done. His company's board eventually had no choice but to remove him from his own empire, citing the financial risks of keeping him as CEO. In the span of a few months, he had lost everything: the company, his reputation, his influence. For the first time, he understood what it was like to be powerless. He had spent years making her feel small, treating her as if she were nothing without him. But now, he was the one being cast aside, the one people whispered about with pity and contempt. He had mocked her in court, certain that she would leave with nothing. But in the end, he was the one who had truly lost. And the irony of it all was that the very woman he had tried to erase was now the only one who had ever truly believed in him. Months later, as she walked through a quiet cafe, she spotted him at a corner table. He was alone, hunched over a newspaper, the lines on his face deeper, his once impeccable posture slightly slouched. He no longer had the air of invincibility that had once defined him. His clothes were still expensive, but they no longer carried the effortless confidence they once did. He looked like a man who had fought a losing battle and knew it. For a brief moment, their eyes met. His gaze held something unfamiliar, something that almost resembled regret. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but she simply gave him a polite nod before walking past him. There was nothing left to be said. She didn't need an apology, didn't need closure from him. She had already found it on her own. As she stepped outside, she felt the cool breeze against her skin. The world opened before her in ways it had never been before. She had fought, she had won, but most importantly, she had moved on. And as she disappeared into the bustling streets, leaving him behind in that cafe, it became clear he was now the one trapped in the past, while she was walking toward a future of her own making. Days turned into weeks, and the trial that once dominated the headlines gradually faded from the public's memory. But for him, the aftermath was inescapable. Every business venture he attempted collapsed before it could begin. Investors no longer trusted his name, former allies refused to return his calls, and job offers were non-existent. He had spent years building an empire, convinced of his untouchable status, but now, he was learning a painful truth: the fall from power is far lonelier than the climb. The people who once clung to him for wealth and status had moved on, finding new figures to orbit. And for the first time, he understood what it meant to be truly alone. The house he had once filled with lavish parties now stood eerily quiet. His finances, once an endless source of pride, had dwindled due to legal battles and settlement costs. He had assumed that, no matter what happened, he would always land on his feet. But the reality was far different. He had built his life on the illusion that he alone was responsible for his success, dismissing everyone who had supported him along the way. And now, standing in the empty shell of what was once his home, he finally understood, without the people who had truly believed in him, he had nothing. But the worst part wasn't the financial loss or the humiliation. It was knowing that she had moved on. She had rebuilt herself, stronger than ever, while he remained shackled to the ruins of his own making. He thought about that moment in the cafe, the way she had looked at him, not with anger, not with spite, but with indifference. That, more than anything, was what haunted him. She had once fought for his attention, for his validation. Now, she saw him as nothing more than a figure from her past, a shadow that no longer had any hold on her. And for the first time in his life, he wished he could go back and undo everything. She never wasted time looking back. While he remained trapped in regret, she was embracing the life she had fought so hard to reclaim. Every morning, she woke up to a home filled with warmth, with possibility. The small business she had started was thriving, not because she needed financial security, but because it gave her a purpose that was entirely her own. She surrounded herself with people who valued her, who saw her for who she was rather than what she could offer them. It was a stark contrast to the isolation she had once endured in a marriage where her voice had been dismissed. One afternoon, she found herself walking through the city streets, taking in the sights with a newfound appreciation. She passed by the office building where she had once spent countless hours working beside him, pouring her efforts into a company that had refused to acknowledge her. But there was no bitterness in her heart. She had fought for recognition, not out of revenge, but because she refused to let herself be erased. And now, she didn't need the company's validation. She had built something greater, her own happiness, her own independence, her own success. A friend once asked her if she ever regretted marrying him, if she wished she had never been a part of his world. But she shook her head. No, she had said simply. Because I wouldn't be who I am now if I hadn't lived through it. The past had shaped her, had tested her, but it had not defined her. She had walked through fire and emerged stronger, wiser. And now, every step she took was toward a future she had built for herself, free from the chains of his name and the weight of his shadow. He spent months attempting to salvage what was left of his name, but the damage was irreversible. The industry that once welcomed him with open arms had turned its back on him, unwilling to trust a man whose success had been built on deception. He had spent his life ensuring that he was seen as powerful, as untouchable. But now, his name was a liability, a reminder of a scandal that no one wanted to be associated with. He had mocked her in court, certain that she would leave with nothing. But in the end, it was he who had been left behind. Even those who had once supported him no longer saw him the same way. To them, he wasn't the brilliant businessman he had once claimed to be, he was the man who had underestimated his wife, who had tried to erase her and failed. His attempts to re-enter the business world were met with rejection after rejection. No one wanted to risk their reputation by aligning with him. He had spent years believing that wealth and influence would always protect him, but now he realized the painful truth: without respect, without integrity, everything else was meaningless. One evening, he sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, scrolling through news articles, searching for any mention of himself. But instead, he found her name. She had been featured in a business magazine, not as his ex-wife, but as a successful entrepreneur in her own right. There was a photo of her, standing confidently in her office, smiling, radiant. And as he stared at the screen, he felt the weight of his mistakes settle deep into his bones. She had moved on. She had thrived. And he had nothing left but regret. She never expected to see him again. But one evening, as she left a restaurant, she caught sight of him standing on the opposite side of the street. He looked different, thinner, older, as if the weight of the past had finally taken its toll. He hesitated for a moment, then crossed the street toward her. She remained still, watching as he approached, noting the uncertainty in his steps. This was not the man who had once laughed at her in court, who had belittled her in front of strangers. This was a man who had been humbled by his own downfall. He cleared his throat, as if searching for the right words. He hesitated, glancing down before meeting her eyes again. I wanted to say, I was wrong. The words were barely above a whisper, but they carried the weight of years of arrogance, of mistakes he could never undo. He had once believed himself incapable of failure, incapable of regret. But now, standing before her, he looked like a man who had lost everything and finally understood why. She nodded slowly, taking in the sight of him one last time. I know, she said, her voice calm. There was no anger, no resentment, only the quiet certainty of a woman who had already found her peace. She offered him a small, knowing smile before turning away, walking toward the life she had built for herself. He remained standing there, watching as she disappeared into the night, realizing that this was the last time their paths would ever cross. Her life flourished in ways she never could have imagined. With each passing day, she felt more like herself, free from the burdens of the past. The business she had built continued to grow, not because she needed wealth, but because she loved the challenge, the creation, the independence. She surrounded herself with people who valued her, who saw her for the brilliant, capable woman she had always been. And for the first time in years, she felt truly at home in her own life. She no longer thought of him. His name, once a shadow lingering over her, had faded into irrelevance. She had spent too many years fighting to be heard, fighting to be seen. Now, she didn't need to fight for anything, she simply lived, and that was enough. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer hurt. They were reminders of a battle won, of a woman who had reclaimed her story. And as she stood on the balcony of her new home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she smiled, knowing that this was just the beginning. Her past had shaped her, but it did not define her. She had walked through fire, and now, she stood on the other side, stronger, wiser, and completely free. The past no longer haunted her. For years, she had carried its weight like a chain, every cruel word, every moment of humiliation a reminder of the battle she had endured. But now, as she walked through the city streets, she realized something remarkable. She was no longer looking over her shoulder. The anger, the resentment, even the need for justice had faded, replaced by something far more powerful, peace. She had fought for herself, reclaimed her dignity, and now, she was free to live without the shadows of yesterday. She had built a life that was truly hers. Every decision she made, every step she took, was for herself and no one else. Her business was thriving, not because she sought revenge, but because she was passionate about her work. She had forged new friendships, surrounded herself with people who valued her not as someone's ex-wife, but as an individual with her own strength and vision. And most importantly, she had learned to love herself again, to see her worth, independent of anyone else's validation. One evening, as she sat by the window of her favorite cafe, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She no longer needed closure, no longer needed answers. Life had given her everything she once thought she had lost: self-respect, confidence, and a future full of possibilities. As she lifted her cup of coffee, she smiled softly to herself. The battle was over, but her story was just beginning. And this time, she was the sole author of her destiny.